Hello, my name is Geno Samuel, and welcome back to Discographies, yes, where I'm going through the entire studio album discography of the prog rock band Yes. So, for their follow-up to Relayer, their 7th album, the band went to record at Mountain Studios in Montreux, Switzerland. At the same time, Emerson, Lake and Palmer were finishing up recording their album Works in the same studio space that was meant for Yes, but they were running into overtime, which left Yes writing new material in rehearsal space nearby for a few weeks. And quite a lot of the tracks that ended up on the final release were developed during these sessions, with contributions from Patrick Moraz, of course. However, things were gonna change very soon for Patrick Moraz. They had recorded early versions of the songs like Going for the One and Wondrous Stories, and they were sent to Rick Wakeman because the manager Brian Lane was interested in bringing back Wakeman at least as a session musician, and he was quite fond of the demos he heard. So Rick arrived in Switzerland and reconnected with the other band members and felt that they had all had time to grow up and were now better for it. It seemed like there was a conspiracy to oust Moraz from the group and take Wakeman back. Moraz was quite abruptly asked to leave the band to make room for Wakeman. John Anderson had said that Moraz wasn't pulling his weight musically, but Moraz himself said that the decision came as a complete shock, and it upset him greatly and put him under great psychological pressure. And among other things, he apparently never received adequate compensation for his participation in the band, and allegedly he never was paid at all for their 1976 tour. At a certain party in Switzerland, Lane and Chris Squire convinced Rick Wakeman to rejoin Yes as a full-time member when they had in fact informed the press of his return well before Wakeman said that he would. He would find out himself the next morning when all of a sudden Wakeman Rejoins Yes was on the front cover of music magazine Melody Maker. Poor Moraz. A Yes roadie had stated that the other members were too closely knit as Englishmen, and he never really had a chance at fitting in due to his acute foreignness. He went on to play for the Moody Blues for over a decade, and he got shat all over by that band too at the end. Poor Moraz. He led an extremely eventful and colorful life, but that's a tale for another topographic ocean. Anyway, Jesus Christ. The album, which now featured the Topographic Oceans lineup, was recorded for the first time in a long time with a completely new engineering crew after Eddie Offord decided to no longer participate. Sound engineering was done by John Timperley and assisted by David Richards, who would go on to produce albums by Queen and their individual personnel. Yes, we're also completely self-producing the album. Another change is the artwork, which, even though it features the classic Yes logo design, is not made by Roger Dean anymore. He did have an idea for the cover, and he went to Switzerland to pitch it to Anderson, but he was not interested at all, and he was in the middle of sketching out what he wanted the album cover to look like. According to Steve Howe, it was Anderson who was no longer interested in working with Dean, which resulted in a break of the Yes-Dean collaborations for a while. The new, wildly different design was created by Storm Thurgenson and Aubrey Powell of the art design project Hypnosis, who were, together and apart, responsible for producing some of the most iconic album covers of all time. This new change in image reflected on the new change of sound too, with the tracks losing sense of a deeper concept and became more short and accessible, perhaps changing with the times and the new musical landscape. Well, they did get shorter for the most part, but they still weren't 3-minute pop songs either. So let's just jump into it, shall we? The opening number, Going for the One, opens with a faint count-off from Alan White doing the classic 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. In comes Howe with an unexpected line from a steel guitar, which he plays for the entire song. The opening at least sounds pretty competent, as the band lay into a kind of country rock groove with some elements of 50s rock and roll too. It's definitely got my attention. Then the singing comes in. The key is way too high. Even Anderson has trouble reaching those high notes, and probably some of the highest notes he has ever recorded. In later live shows, they transposed the song down a step or so, which would have suited it better on the record too, I think. Another thing, which is an issue all across the album, is the mixing. The vocals, I feel, are too low and lacking bass. I know Anderson's voice isn't exactly a baritone, but still, he sounded fuller in previous works. There's some really great powerful counter melodies and vocals from Squire and maybe Howe, The lyrics themselves come from lots of different inspirations, such as sports, horse racing, and a film about the Grand Canyon. What the hell is my eye? Wakeman comes in spurts with these sweeping synth effects a lot, and his contribution to the chorus is a bit odd. Lots of it is just block chords on piano. I don't know, maybe Wakeman was tacked on after the majority of the song was already completed before he truly rejoined the group. There's a kind of cool instrumental section where the band really go meat and potatoes, with Wakeman now contributing a groovy rock and roll piano line as Howe restlessly swishes his slide up and down and around his guitar. Towards the end, they launch into a pretty climactic sounding section pushed by an ascending and descending bass line based on a minor scale, while the vocals in harmony spread out phrases 2 syllables at a time, reminiscent of a similar segment in Siberian Khatru. It is quite repetitive, and naturally, it builds up over time with some added percussion, as yes do these sort of things. But dear God, Steve Howe is still on his steel guitar playing a muffled solo on top of the vocals, and it just sounds not tasteful at all. At some points, it just sounds like a sped up ambulance speeding by, like, is this cool? Is this what you want? Is this what the fans like? It just makes me feel that Relayer was a complete fluke. You know, it wasn't meant to work at all, because he's doing kind of the same thing as he did in Sounds Chaser, playing a constant crazy solo throughout the song, but perhaps it's just slightly less crazy here. And for some reason, it's simply gnawing at you, like, Jesus Christ, give it a rest already. Anyway, the ending is epic and superb. And overall, it's a cool idea for a song. It's got a nice and fresh feel from the band, but it suffers greatly from some dodgy mixing, and Steve Howe... Next we have Turn of the Century, a touching linear narrative telling the tale of a man named Rowan, who, after his wife dies in the winter, carves out a statue of her, bringing her back to life. It's quite a tricky piece of music throughout, with a slow build-up of acoustic guitar, vocals, and then bass and synth pad that keeps the chords in check, basically, because everyone else seems to be performing an entire melody of their own, and they intersect each other occasionally, either playing a short phrase in unison, or in harmony, or with a delay. It's a charming vocal melody, and Steve gets to play on an acoustic guitar, on which he is typically much better behaved. The vocal track, though, is incredibly drenched with reverb. Some, of course, is nice, and would fit well with this song especially, but there's just an overbearing amount of it here. And as a matter of fact, this is another recurring issue across the album. There's too much reverb, especially on the vocals, but on some other instruments too. Squire especially had disputes with the band and the engineers over the reverb, which some members liked and others didn't. Aside from that, this track especially has some nice additions of a brighter color coming from Alan White's tuned mouth percussion, since he doesn't use a rock drum kit for this one, and only plays some atmospheric touches on cymbals and timpani. At around halfway into the song, which is around 3 minutes 50 seconds, there's a bit of a switch over of moods. The music gets darker. Wakeman's delicate piano work is on full display here. Howe comes in with a haunting fade and sliding on electric guitar, and Squire continues to play anything but a bass line. It all swells into a grand cinematic expression, possibly the disjointed melodies converging into one whole, symbolizing the awakening of the statue, and a more powerful return of the previous singing sections. And after a while riding high, it all descends into a similar motif and arrangement as the graceful opening acoustic guitar bit for the closing of the song. If you listen closely, and maybe turn your volume up a bit too, you can hear what sounds like vibes playing a chord sequence from the song very softly after the song ends. A haunting little Easter egg, maybe. It's kind of a challenging piece of music they composed here. It's very dense melodically, and unusually lacking a conventional drum beat, but in places tastefully dramatic, telling a story and conveying emotions like it's all an 8-minute long movie. It's pretty good. Next is Parallels, a piece that Squire came up with during the recording sessions of his album Fish Out of Water. It majestically starts with a chord progression played on a church organ. Once again, like in Close to the Edge, Wakeman went to a church to record on a real organ. This one was in St. Martin's Church in the nearby town of Vevey, 4 miles away. What they did was they rented a telephone line for the day so that the band, still in Mountain Studios, and Wakeman at the church could hear each other and record the song all together. Wakeman stated that it was a magical experience. I'm sure it was. That's some creative engineering right there. During the intro, the electric guitar line soon follows, full of the typical Steve Howe flourishes and runs up and down willy-nilly. It sounds very echoey and muffled, on top of it being tasteless. The drum track too seems to have a slight delay on it, and sounds distant too. The bass sounds pretty decent though not as clear and bright as the trademark sound. Pretty much everyone here sounds like they were recording in a church. It's a pretty cool driving beat though, that occasionally dips its toes into a few brief phrases in odd time signatures. I think the entirety of the singing is done in harmony, led by Anderson and Squire. The voices are once again too low in the mix. The melody of the verses and choruses is kind of boring. The church organ is playing from the start to the end, and maybe, while ambitious and cool in concept, it could have worked better if it arose in the mix for its special sections, but was replaced by some other keyboard instruments instead, to add more variety to a lengthy track. The mood of the song is downright confusing, and it only gets more confuddling with a spitty guitar solo and the introduction of a kick-ass bongo beat, all sustained by a chord bed played on a church organ. What the hell is going on here? Steve Howe is all over the place, but that's no surprise. So many people praise him for incorporating so many different styles into his playing, but I don't think that's necessarily a great thing to have done. I mean, I love pepperoni pizza, apples, baked potatoes, and vanilla ice cream, but I wouldn't put it all into a blender and stuff a turkey with it, would I? Howe goes through these passages of bluegrass psychedelia, which I don't know if they would sound good anywhere. And it's all so muffled and unclear, as if someone turned down the treble completely on his guitar track. They do launch into this breakdown section with vocals proclaiming while the bass sounds like it begins playing the first half of the riff to come together before Chris realizes, wait, no, we can't do that here. This bit is pretty cool, partly because Steve pulls back a bit. This is followed by another solo section, combining organ and guitar, and they do this call and response thing with each other, which I'm sure was cool as hell recording it simultaneously in the studio and the church, 4 miles apart. It all resolves with some more psychedelic Latino Holy Communion rock and roll, and a super satisfying ending full of power and clapping and all-round good fun. It's a pretty fun track. Shame that it kinda sucks. So that concludes Side A. Side B opens with Wondrous Stories, a soft ballad written by Anderson, inspired by a beautiful day while staying at Montreux. And before you ask, no, wondrous is not a word. Wondrous is though, and I'd imagine they added the E to accompany the flow of the chorus melody. Hearing your wondrous stories. The song opens with 2 softly strummed chords, establishing the tonality of the song, played on Steve Howe's Portuguese Vahalia. The melody and lyrics are rather beautiful. In fact, the entire arrangement is exquisite. Though the vocal line, like every track before, is heavy with reverb and just barely keeping itself above the mix. It was Alan's idea for the bass and drums to play in odd occasional beats. The drum and bass come in with a single sustained soft hit either on the beat or off the beat, with different rest periods in between. It's all quite odd, but it works like magic here. Wakeman, I think, plays a polymoog or a polymoog on this one. It's a polyphonic analog synthesizer, which was pretty new at the time, mostly playing synth string-like sounds here. Though he rises up during the choruses for some fanfare-like runs that fill in the gaps in the vocal melody. Bass also sticks its head out from time to time for some lovely space fillers too. Rick performs a dreamy synth solo in the song, and it's full of reverb again. His fingers positively dance, playing some chromatic scales which add to the dreamlike feel. Even so, maybe they overdid it with the reverb a tad. The previous album was all about the flanger, and this one can't keep its hands off the reverb. The last verse features great singing interplay as Squire sings Anderson's lines delayed by 1 bar, creating this canon effect. Howe comes in with some jazzy electric guitar runs towards the end, which are not all that offensive. The track ends with some of that classic, almost chant-like Yes-style deliveries in the vocals. Hearing. This is one of their most poppy tracks in a long while, probably since Sweet Dreams on their second album. It's a fairly simple and well-executed piece, and it was released as a single and charted in the top 10 in the UK, and I think it's still their highest charting single in the UK. I got the 45 of it back in Dublin, with the B-side Parallels. Ugh. Anyway, we then come to the 5th and final track on the album, Awaken. A 15-minute long epic, mostly a brainchild of Anderson and Howe, as the vast majority of their extended cuts. The lyrics were inspired by the book The Singer, a classic retelling of Cosmic Conflict by Calvin Miller, which talked about a star song, an ageless hymn. Maybe Anderson wanted the song to sound like that ageless hymn. It opens with a beautiful piano solo segment from Wakeman, with the grace and precision that only he could accomplish really. It segues into an amazing ethereal section, full of odd but pleasing sounds from synths and wishy-washy guitars. It fully transports you to another cosmic realm. Then Anderson, like a preacher at a cosmic altar, declares, "Our vibration go on!" and a bunch of other phrases that don't make grammatical sense, but they do sound profound regardless. This is probably the only point in the album where I feel the overwhelming reverb on the vocals is acceptable, because it only accentuates the almost spiritual atmosphere of the section, and were the vocals more unprocessed, they would feel out of place, and I would be complaining about a lack of reverb. Then they launch into this main drive of the song, led by a rather exotic-sounding guitar riff in 11/8 time. Chris plays through at least 2 different basses on Awaken, a fretted and a fretless one for sure, but from the Going for the One tour onwards, he used a special 3-necked wall bass guitar for this track alone in their live shows, which has a 6-string bass with special tuning, a fretted and a fretless bass all in one place, and he uses each one over the course of the song, which goes through a lot of sounds. This full band section is a fretless bass line. It's also filled with heavy world percussion, punctuating every beat. The vocals chant their space mantra in ascending sequence. It's all quite spiritual in a way. Howe takes his fingers out for a shred. It definitely sounds cool in places, and plays around with some classically inspired motifs perhaps, of rising sequences. The mix is improved here. The guitar sounds crisp. It gets messy towards the end, of course. Then the 11/8 section theme gets varied up for a few loops or so, goes through different tonalities, and displayed in a major variation for a couple of runs as well, all very classical and cool. This near-hypnotic section comes to a close to give way for a new 6/8 part, introducing a church organ, which I believe was recorded during the same sessions as Parallels, because it would make sense that they would make good use of the full day to record all the organ parts. This section gets pretty virtuosic and goes through a peculiar chord progression, which is a 12-chord repeated phrase that hits all 12 major chords in the scale. The singing reminds me of a witch casting a spell over a witch's brew or something. The vocals are kind of a word salad, chanting mantra while holding little regard to the rhythm of the beat, but of course this was a creative decision. They're doing this because they felt that it was the right thing to do, but it doesn't sit well with me. Of course, this is just my opinion, and feel free to disagree. Honestly, if this whole 6/8 section was something else, I'm sure they could have come up with a better vocal line as well. I'm not bashing it outright. It's not a disgusting piece of music by any means, but I just feel like it could be a lot better. Like with the previous thematic segment, as they approach the end of this one, they twist it around and play it in a minor key variation, which bit by bit slows down to a stop to welcome the middle section of the song, which is just as great as the opener in my opinion. A waltz played on harp and mallet percussion. I can't tell which though. Glockenspiel? I don't know. I'm being brought back into that mystical eternal. There's so much space here. Yes, seem to be quite skilled at creating hypnotic soundscapes. After a while, that bell-like theme gets accompanied by a pipe organ solo, which starts off soft and paced, but grows in intensity and intricacy as the track goes on. Here we also hear a softly picked bass line. This is where the 6-string portion of the wall would be used in their live shows. The ambient choir sound in the background also rises up slowly to the surface, and while I originally thought that it was a synth, perhaps a mellotron, they actually utilized 2 choirs for this part, like real ones. The Ars Latte of Lasagna Choir and Richard Williams singers, recorded at the Eagles de Planches Church in Montreux. The organ line grows more powerful as it addresses the motifs heard in the opening piano part, bringing the overall composition together structurally. Lots of dreamy harp glissandos are going on as well. Then we get to a hugeness of sound not heard since the climax of I Get Up, I Get Down on Close to the Edge, as the guitar, now in a mellowy jazz tone, reappears and helps bring back the rest of the band, who now launch into a half-time variation of the previous 12-chord cycle. The vocals still exhibit that weird, unsettled rhythm and lyrical flow that gives way to another guitar solo, which has even less rhythm and sensible flow. It all crescendos once more for a stellar resolution with heavy focus on organ, which fades into a reprise of the smooth, wonderful, free rhythm, high vibration go on movement. It largely is played the same way with some added guitars and soft bass lines. Then they continue further into the movement, adding on to it. There's some timpani-like rolls on toms, increasing the epicness level greatly. It feels like it slowly dies down and settles into the final root chord, which would normally be the end of the song, but then Steve delivers a lovely country-esque part on electric guitar which softly glides the song and the album finally to a close. It's considered by many to be one of the best Yes albums, with AWAKEN being a fan favorite and often regarded as one of the best, if not the best, track from Yes. Personally, I think the opening and closing movements are stunning, for sure one of their best, and one of Anderson's finest vocal deliveries. The middle section too is quite sublime, however I'm not crazy about the rest of it. I mean, it's not bad, but I feel like that record space could have been used better. Overall, the album suffers from Offert's absence, I think. The mixing is terribly uneven, with the vocals especially almost given second billing. Actually, what it sounds like is the band are trying to put themselves on an equal plane. I understand this because I've battled with this issue when mixing my own music. Because I'm very familiar with my own songs and what's going on in them, I don't feel too much of a lack of volume in the vocals because I know the lyrics, and I don't need to hear what I'm saying because I know it all. And I don't want any one thing too loud or too soft, so I try to mix it all to roughly the same level. But an outsider hearing the song for the first time might strain to hear the lyrics and make out what's going on. And an outsider co-producer like Offert was essential in pulling the band together and keeping them under control, bringing out elements when needed and sedating members when needed too. But without that supervision, I think the results in relation to mixing and some arrangements were mixed. Whatever Howe was doing right on Relayer is gone by now. Last words, under some better supervision in regards to some compositional embellishments and the mixing, and all that godforsaken reverb, this could have been a pretty solid album, but as it stands, it's largely too crowded thematically and so washed out. Sounds like everyone was playing in a church sometimes. I think the most well put together track on the album is their 3-minute something long folk pop song, Wondrous Stories. So final result, Going for the One gets a 6.2 out of 10 for me. The album was released in July 1977 and reached number 1 in the UK album charts. They went on another huge promotional tour, including 5 sellout shows at the Wembley Stadium. And with that wrapped up, it was time to go back into the studio and venture on. So how did the newly reformed Classic Yes lineup fare in their 9th album? Well, tune in this Friday when I'll be taking a look into their 9th album, Tornado. Like and subscribe for more music reviews and original music. Special thanks to my patrons, and if you're interested in contributing, there's links to my Patreon and original music in the description down below. Thanks again, see you around. Why am I so hyper today? What the hell am I doing with my hands?